Imagine being the most powerful man in the world, worshipped as a living god, surrounded by gold, temples, and armies that bowed to your every command. Now imagine that same god-king slipping something into his mouth that would slowly, quietly, and without mercy bring his reign to a sudden and humiliating end. Not at the hands of an assassin, not on a battlefield, not even in some grand conspiracy, but by his own hand, or rather his own appetite. This is the story of a pharaoh whose death was written not in prophecy, but in poison. And it wasn't quick, it wasn't clean, and it definitely wasn't the glorious ending Egypt liked to carve into stone. Ancient Egypt has never been short of dramatic endings. Pharaohs were supposed to go out like legends. Some vanished into battle, some were murdered in palace intrigue, and some were remembered as tyrants or visionaries. But one pharaoh's fate was stranger than all of them, because while most rulers feared blades, rebellions, or divine punishment, this man's downfall came from something you'd expect at a bad dinner party: his food. A pharaoh, undone by poison he likely didn't even realize he was taking. Not an enemy's trick, not a servant's betrayal, but an accidental overdose from the very substances he thought would keep him strong, powerful, and eternal. So how does a god-king, guarded by priests, physicians, and entire armies, end up poisoning himself to death? To understand this bizarre death, you first need to step inside the world of ancient Egyptian medicine, diet, and a little obsession with immortality that went a step too far. Because in Egypt, food wasn't just food, it was medicine, it was magic, it was power, and sometimes it was deadly. Let's set the stage. Ancient Egyptian rulers were obsessed with their health, and with good reason. In a world where disease could wipe out entire communities, where infections had no antibiotics, and where a bad tooth could actually kill you, pharaohs turned to their priests and physicians to keep their bodies in top condition. They had the best medical minds of their time, and Egypt really was advanced. They could set bones, perform minor surgeries, and they even wrote medical manuals thousands of years before Greece. But here's the twist: a lot of that medicine was mixed with magic, ritual, and a healthy dose of trial and error, which means pharaohs often ended up swallowing some extremely questionable treatments. And this is where our unlucky ruler enters the story. Historians point to Amenhotep III, the 9th pharaoh of the 18th dynasty, as one of the most likely candidates for this poisoned fate. Known as the Magnificent, Amenhotep ruled during one of Egypt's most prosperous periods. He built temples, monuments, and was worshipped like a god on earth. But behind the grandeur, his health was falling apart. Excavations of his mummy reveal severe dental problems, abscesses, rotting teeth, and infections that must have caused him excruciating pain. Imagine being the ruler of the most powerful empire in the world and being brought to your knees by something as small as a tooth. Pain relief became his obsession, and that obsession may have been what killed him. So what was he taking? The answer is both fascinating and horrifying. Ancient Egyptians used a variety of herbs, minerals, and animal products in their medical treatments. Some of these actually worked. Honey, for instance, was a natural antiseptic, but others were lethal if taken in the wrong doses. Substances like henbane, mandrake, and even opium were used to dull pain. They also used heavy metals like lead and copper compounds, believing they had healing powers. But the most dangerous of all was something called colchicine, derived from the autumn crocus. Even in tiny amounts, it was highly toxic, and evidence suggests the pharaoh may have been regularly treated with such plant-based medicines, slowly dosing himself with poison day after day. And here's where the irony gets darker. To the Egyptians, these treatments weren't seen as risky. They were sacred. Priests believed certain plants carried divine powers to heal or protect, and pharaohs trusted those priests without question. So while Amenhotep thought he was being preserved by the gods, he was actually being slowly destroyed by them. Every remedy was another step closer to his death. In fact, scientists studying his remains have found chemical traces consistent with poisoning from plant alkaloids, toxins that build up silently until your body can't take any more. But the story doesn't stop at medicine. There's another layer, the Pharaoh's diet. Being king meant feasting like no one else, and Egyptian royalty were notorious for their indulgence. Their meals were heavy with bread, beer, honey, figs, meat and wine, luxuries ordinary Egyptians barely tasted. Sounds delicious, right? Except all of this came with a price. Studies of royal mummies, including Amenhotep's, show signs of obesity, diabetes, and clogged arteries. Add poison-laced medicine on top of that, and you've got a body that was already weakened, struggling to process toxins, and heading straight for collapse. Picture it, the pharaoh, seated at a lavish banquet surrounded by gold cups and dancers, sipping wine mixed with herbal extracts, meant to dull his pain. Every sip easing his agony for a few moments, but pushing his body closer to failure. It's almost cinematic, the most powerful man alive, unknowingly toasting his own death with every drink. And when the end came, it wasn't glamorous. Poisoning by alkaloids like colchicine is slow and brutal. Symptoms include burning pain, vomiting, organ failure, and eventually collapse. Imagine the god king writhing in agony while priests and physicians tried to help, not realizing they were the ones who had caused it. The irony is almost too sharp. The man considered divine, undone not by rival kings or gods, but by the very cures meant to protect him. But here's where the mystery deepens. Was it really accidental, or was the pharaoh helped along by people close to him? After all, palace intrigue was as common in Egypt as sand on the Nile. Pharaohs had enemies, ambitious wives, rival heirs, and priests who wanted more power. Poison was a convenient weapon, and history is full of rulers taken out by a little something in their drink. Could Amenhotep have been deliberately poisoned under the cover of medical treatment? Was someone in his court slipping him stronger doses, knowing it would look like medicine but act like murder? We may never know for sure, but the possibility is chilling, and the aftermath was just as strange. When archaeologists unwrapped Amenhotep's mummy, they discovered his body in unusually poor condition. It wasn't just the decay of time. It looked like something had gone terribly wrong with his preservation. Some scientists believe the embalmers struggled because of the poison in his body, which had accelerated decomposition. In other words, the pharaoh was so full of toxins that even in death, his body refused to cooperate with the rituals meant to make him eternal. Imagine that. A king who sought immortality through medicine and ritual, ending up sabotaged by his own poisoned corpse. Now, before you think this was a one-off tragedy, here's the twist. Amenhotep wasn't the only one. Other mummies from the same era show similar signs of poisoning, suggesting this might have been a broader problem with Egyptian medicine. In their quest for divine healing, rulers were dosing themselves with substances we now recognize as lethal. It wasn't just one pharaoh who paid the price. It may have been an occupational hazard of wearing the crown. And yet, despite the agony and the irony, Egyptians still believed their methods worked. Priests and physicians continued prescribing toxic plants, metals, and minerals for centuries. They couldn't see the pattern, because to them, pharaohs were supposed to die dramatically. A god-king brought down by mysterious illness, that was just divine will. The idea that they'd poisoned him themselves would have been unthinkable, which means this cycle of accidental poisonings may have quietly repeated itself again and again, hidden behind the grandeur of tombs and temples. If Amenhotep's poisoned body was a warning, no one in Egypt seemed to notice. In fact, the relationship between Egyptian rulers and their medicine only grew stranger. Pharaohs trusted their physicians almost as much as their generals. These weren't ordinary healers. They were priest-doctors who mixed science with divine ritual. And in their world, a prescription was as much about pleasing the gods as it was about curing pain. So when a pharaoh swallowed ground minerals, toxic herbs, or even traces of heavy metals, it wasn't just treatment. It was a holy act. That trust, that blind faith in ritual medicine, is what made the danger invisible. The line between cure and curse blurred until it was almost impossible to see. The physicians themselves weren't quacks. For their time, they were brilliant. They understood the basics of anatomy, recognized certain diseases, and knew that wounds healed better when cleaned with honey or resins. But when it came to chronic pain, like the kind Amenhotep suffered from with his failing teeth, they had few options. Pain was seen as a spiritual imbalance, so the treatments had to be powerful, dramatic, and often dangerous. They turned to opium for relief, mandrake for sedation, and henbane for muscle spasms. Each of these plants carries serious toxicity, if taken often. Combined with the pharaoh's lavish diet, it was like stacking one health problem on top of another, until the foundation finally cracked. But the pharaoh wasn't just a patient, he was the ultimate test subject. His court physicians experimented on him with every new preparation, every exotic plant that traders brought from across the empire. Egypt was a crossroads of ancient trade, and with it came substances from Africa, the Near East, and even further east into Asia. Spices, herbs, resins, and minerals all found their way into Egyptian pharmacies. Some were harmless, even helpful. Others, silent killers. And who better to try them on than the man who demanded to live forever? Every sip from his golden cup was a gamble, and the stakes were nothing less than the stability of the entire empire. Now imagine this in daily life. The pharaoh wakes in his palace, already in pain from abscesses that throb through his jaw. His attendants bring bread, figs, and wine, but also a bitter herbal concoction mixed with honey to disguise the taste. Priests murmur spells over it, calling on gods to drive away evil spirits. He drinks it, grimacing, then sits back as the pain dulls for an hour, only to return worse than before. Later, more mixtures, stronger doses, and new plants to try. A cycle that repeats day after day, until the poisons build up enough to stop his organs from working. To the court, it looked like a divine mystery. To us it looks like poisoning in slow motion, and the embalmers noticed something too. They worked with dozens of royal bodies, and yet Amenhotep's mummy stood out. Chemical analysis shows unusual damage to his tissues, suggesting something corrosive inside him before he died. His flesh had degraded rapidly, unlike the preserved state priests worked so hard to achieve. Even thousands of years later, science can see the fingerprints of poison. His death wasn't a sudden strike, like an assassin's blade. It was creeping, invisible, and stretched over weeks or months. A man of unimaginable power, undone by invisible doses he never questioned. But Amenhotep's story is only one thread in a much larger tapestry of Egyptian medicine and mortality. Across dynasties, rulers turned to increasingly exotic remedies, convinced they could bend nature to their will. Some even experimented with mercury and lead compounds, both toxic metals we now know devastate the nervous system and organs. The very substances meant to make them divine instead stripped away their strength. When we study royal remains today, we don't just find signs of disease, we find traces of the medicines that may have hastened their deaths. And it wasn't just the pharaohs themselves. Egyptian nobles and elites often copied royal practices, hoping to share in their power and longevity. Imagine wealthy officials sipping the same poisonous mixtures, believing they were protected by divine forces, while slowly sabotaging their bodies. Entire layers of Egyptian society may have been poisoned by their own medical traditions, never realizing the hidden cost. Meanwhile, ordinary Egyptians stuck to simpler remedies: honey for wounds, garlic for infections, willow bark for pain. Ironically, the common people may have had a safer medical system than the kings they served. But there's another twist. Food itself could be medicine, and sometimes poison disguised as a delicacy. Egyptian banquets were legendary, overflowing with bread, beer, wine, roasted meats, and sweet fruits. Yet many of these came with risks. Wine, for instance, was often flavored with herbs and resins that doubled as painkillers or stimulants. Some of these additives were toxic in large doses, so every celebration, every feast was also an experiment in chemistry. Pharaohs may have been toasting victories with goblets laced in slow-acting poisons, their effects masked by ritual and luxury. The obsession with eternal life only made things worse. Pharaohs weren't content with simply living long. They wanted to transcend mortality itself. Their bodies had to remain strong enough to rule, and later, to endure the afterlife. That pressure pushed their physicians to experiment with stronger and stranger mixtures. If a root numbed the pain, they used more of it. If a mineral was sacred, they ground it finer, drank it more often. Over time, the line between devotion and self-destruction disappeared completely. And when the pharaoh's body finally gave out, priests explained it as divine will, not as a side effect of the very cures they prescribed. There's a chilling irony here. The pharaoh was considered divine, yet he was also the most fragile of them all. His body bore the weight of rituals, experiments and poisons disguised as blessings. His people saw his death as a cosmic mystery, but in reality, the mystery was simple. The pharaoh had poisoned himself, guided by a medical system that couldn't tell the difference between salvation and slow execution. And while Amenhotep's name stands out, he was far from the last ruler to suffer this fate. Centuries later, other pharaohs would follow similar paths, dosing themselves with dangerous substances in pursuit of health and eternity. Some mummies show traces of mercury, others of arsenic, all signs that the most powerful men in Egypt were slowly dismantling themselves from within. Their palaces hid not just splendor, but laboratories of unintentional self-destruction. What makes this story even stranger is how it fits into a larger human pattern. Egypt wasn't alone in using poisons as medicine. The Greeks, the Romans, the Chinese, all experimented with substances we now know are toxic. But in Egypt, the link between medicine and religion made it almost impossible to question. If the gods demanded a root, a resin, or a metal, then it was taken. And if the patient died, well, that was the god's choice. To question the treatment was to question divine will itself, which means pharaohs, no matter how powerful, were trapped in a system that practically guaranteed they'd consume poison sooner or later, and the effects went beyond death. Imagine the chaos in the royal court when a pharaoh suddenly fell ill, his body failing while priests scrambled to explain why. Succession crises erupted, power shifted, and entire dynasties stumbled because one man trusted a poisoned cup. History remembers temples, pyramids, and monuments, but behind those walls, medicine may have been quietly rewriting the fate of Egypt itself. A single miscalculated dose could bring down not just a ruler, but the empire he controlled. The deeper you look into Egyptian medicine, the stranger the picture becomes. On one hand, their physicians recorded observations that were astonishingly advanced. They could diagnose diseases by symptoms, they catalogued hundreds of remedies, and they even had specialized doctors for different parts of the body. But on the other hand, their cures often involved ingredients that read like the contents of a magician's workshop: ground gemstones, powdered metals, animal parts, strange herbs. The line between medicine and alchemy was paper thin. And when those mixtures were given to pharaohs, the doses were higher, the rituals more elaborate, and the risks far deadlier. What made this even more dangerous was how carefully these remedies were wrapped in ritual. A physician didn't just hand over a potion. It was blessed, chanted over, sometimes even written into a spell on papyrus. The pharaoh wasn't drinking a medicine, he was drinking the god's will. That gave the treatment an aura of untouchable authority. If the pharaoh felt worse after taking it, then clearly the illness was stubborn, or the gods were testing him. The possibility that the cure itself was killing him never entered the picture. Imagine being trapped in a feedback loop where every dose makes you sicker, but the only answer is to take more. Archaeological evidence supports just how far these practices went. Traces of toxic metals like lead and copper have been found in mummies' hair and tissues, signs of prolonged exposure. In some cases, even mercury, a substance so volatile that embalmers later used it to preserve bodies, but in life it may have been given as a medicine for parasites or skin conditions. These weren't accidental contaminations, they were intentional treatments, repeated often enough to leave their mark centuries later. And for pharaohs who consumed more of everything, the buildup would have been catastrophic. Picture Amenhotep sitting in his chambers, his physicians presenting a shining cup filled with wine darkened by crushed herbs. He drinks because what else can he do? He believes this mixture will soothe the pain tearing through his jaw, stop the infection spreading in his gums, or give him the strength to stand tall before his court. For a few minutes, maybe it does. The numbness creeps in, the pain softens, but inside his body, organs are working overtime to process toxins they were never designed to handle. Day after day, those poisons stack higher, until the man who seemed untouchable is brought down not by enemies, but by his own trusted healers. And if the pharaoh noticed, if he suspected something wasn't right, who could he even turn to? To question his doctors was to question the gods. To accuse them of poisoning him would be to admit weakness, and weakness was a luxury pharaohs could not afford. His people saw him as the embodiment of divine power. To let them know that he was crumbling under invisible poisons would shake the very foundation of his rule. So he stayed silent, endured the treatments, and let the cycle continue until it killed him. The tragedy is amplified when you consider how public Pharaoh's health often was. Unlike modern leaders who could conceal their illnesses, pharaohs had entire rituals tied to their physical strength. Festivals required them to run, lift, and perform before crowds as proof of vitality. A failing pharaoh wasn't just a sick man, he was a political problem, which meant his physicians would double down on their treatments, pushing stronger remedies, more exotic substances, anything to keep him standing long enough to maintain the illusion of godhood. The very pressure to appear divine may have been the reason he ended up poisoning himself beyond recovery. And it wasn't just medicine that carried hidden toxins. The environment of Egypt itself contributed to the pharaoh's decline. Nile water, while life-giving, was often contaminated with parasites and minerals. Food storage methods sometimes introduce molds or toxins into grain. Add to that the royal obsession with lavish, sugary foods and endless alcohol, and you have a recipe for bodies already strained long before poison-laced medicine was added on top. Modern science paints a grim picture. Pharaohs suffered from arteriosclerosis, diabetes, and obesity at staggering rates for their time. They were walking medical disasters waiting for one more insult to push them over the edge. That insult came from substances we now classify as poisons. Alkaloids from plants like mandrake and henbane can paralyze the nervous system. Heavy metals like lead and copper damage the brain and organs. Colchicine, if it was indeed in his treatment, causes vomiting, burning pain, and multi-organ failure. Combine these with a body already compromised by chronic illness, and the outcome was inevitable. The pharaoh, the god on earth, undone by invisible killers that crept in with every meal, every ritual, every sip of medicine. And yet, to the people of Egypt, his death was framed in entirely different terms. Priests and scribes didn't carve warnings about poison into stone. They described his passing as the will of the gods, the pharaoh ascending to join the sun in the afterlife. The truth, that their king had essentially overdosed on his own medicine, was hidden beneath layers of myth and ritual. His tomb was filled with treasures meant to sustain him in eternity, even as his body bore the marks of treatments that betrayed him. The disconnect between what the people believed and what actually killed him could not have been greater. But the story doesn't end with Amenhotep. Later pharaohs continued down the same path, sometimes with even stranger results. Some mummies have been found with evidence of deliberate dosing with arsenic or antimony, both highly toxic. Whether these were medicines, poisons administered by enemies, or preservation experiments gone wrong, they all point to the same truth. Egyptian rulers lived and died in a haze of substances they never fully understood. They reached for eternity, and instead consumed slow poison. The strangest part is how normalized this was. No one in the palace seems to have considered the risk. Physicians kept prescribing, pharaohs kept swallowing, and the cycle continued for generations. It was a hidden tradition, passed down like a curse, and each time a ruler collapsed, Egypt turned to divine explanations rather than questioning the medicine. The pattern repeated itself in silence, masked by ceremony, until history itself forgot what really happened. Only in modern times, with chemical analysis of ancient remains, have we begun to see the fingerprints of poison etched into the bones and tissues of Egypt's god-kings. And yet, it raises one last disturbing possibility. What if not all of these poisonings were accidental? After all, pharaohs were not invincible in politics. They were surrounded by rivals, wives competing for their sons to inherit, priests demanding more influence, generals eyeing power. If a pharaoh's cup was already filled with medicines that could kill him slowly, it would take almost nothing for an ambitious rival to tip the balance with a stronger dose. Poisoning disguised as healing, death is hidden in the rituals of medicine. Was Amenhotep's end truly accidental, or was it a carefully orchestrated exit, masked by tradition? The answer may never be clear, but the possibility lingers like a shadow in the tombs of the Valley of the Kings. The longer you follow this trail of poison through Egyptian history, the clearer the pattern becomes. Pharaohs were not only vulnerable to the mistakes of medicine, they were also uniquely exposed to the politics behind it. Every dose that passed their lips was prepared by someone, and in a court filled with ambition, loyalty was always uncertain. The difference between a healing draught and a fatal one could be a matter of a single crushed leaf, a slightly larger pinch of resin, or a dose poured just a little too generously. To everyone watching, it looked like medicine. To the pharaoh's body, it was a countdown. Consider how precarious succession really was. Egypt's throne was the most coveted seat of power in the ancient world. A single pharaoh's death could change dynasties, rewrite alliances, and decide wars. If you were a priest hoping to elevate your influence, a general wanting to put your candidate on the throne, or even a queen determined to secure her son's future, what easier weapon could you find than the pharaoh's own trusted cup? No daggers, no assassins, no visible violence, just a stronger measure of the same medicine he already drank every day. The pharaoh's own faith in ritual made him the easiest target of all. But even without conspiracy, the danger was already built in. The pharaoh's body was a battlefield between tradition and survival. His physicians relied on centuries of inherited recipes, some useful, many dangerous, none precisely measured. In a time without accurate scales or chemical knowledge, the difference between treatment and poison was luck. Imagine trying to treat an infection with mandrake root. A little might ease pain, too much could stop a man's heart. For ordinary Egyptians, the doses were small, the risks manageable. For the pharaoh, whose pain demanded constant treatment, the amounts piled higher and higher until they crossed the line into lethal territory. The tragedy of Amenhotep's end was written, not only in his suffering, but in how invisible it was to those around him. His court saw a divine ruler battling illness, not a man poisoned by devotion to his healers. They prepared him for eternity with rituals, treasures, and prayers, never realizing that eternity had been shortened by their own hands. His tomb speaks of glory, but his body tells another story, of a king consumed by the very cures meant to protect him. And still, the cycle went on. Other pharaohs showed signs of the same fate. Some suffered mysterious deaths at relatively young ages, their bodies riddled with evidence of toxins. Others lived long enough to pass their thrones, but their mummies reveal the same silent chemical fingerprints. It's as if Egypt's rulers carried an invisible inheritance, not just crowns and monuments, but the poisons hidden in their daily rituals. They ruled in splendor, but beneath the gold and ceremony, their bodies bore the cost of mistakes no one dared admit. When you peel back the myths, what remains is almost surreal. The men who commanded armies, raised monuments taller than any other civilization, and were worshipped as gods, were undone by doses of plants and minerals so small you could hold them in your hand. Their deaths weren't thunderbolts of fate, they were slow drips, gathering strength with each swallow, until the divine bodies of pharaohs gave way to the ordinary limits of human flesh. The contrast between image and reality is almost unbearable. Eternal god-kings brought down not by empires, but by their own medicine cabinets. And yet, there's something haunting about how normal it all seemed in their time. No dramatic whispers of poison, no accusations of foul play, just a king growing weaker, priests chanting louder, and physicians offering more of the very thing that was killing him. To his people, it was the rhythm of life and death. To us, it looks like a tragic loop, a civilization too wrapped in ritual to see the cost. Egypt built pyramids that still stand today, but inside its palaces, the greatest rulers were undone by mistakes so small they could hide in a cup of wine. But maybe that's what makes this story linger, because it wasn't just one pharaoh, it wasn't just Amenhotep. It was a pattern stretching across centuries, woven into the very fabric of Egyptian rule. Power, medicine, and ritual tangled together until no one could tell them apart. And in that tangle, pharaohs became their own executioners, swallowing poison disguised as salvation. No assassins, no conspiracies required, just the quiet certainty that each dose was a blessing, when in truth, it was a step closer to the grave. And if the pharaoh himself knew, if in those final days, as his body failed, he realized that the remedies were part of the reason, what then? Did he rage against the priests, or did he believe more strongly than ever, convinced the gods were testing him? Did he die thinking himself cursed, or did he never see the truth at all? The silence of the tomb gives no answer. All we're left with is the evidence. A body marked by poison, a story half hidden in stone, and the uneasy knowledge that the mightiest of kings was, in the end, just as vulnerable as the humblest of men.